Myanmar is a country on the brink of collapse. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against a military coup. They have been met with brutal force. Over 3,800 people have been arrested, many have been tortured, and at least 780 have been killed in street battles. The military seized control on February 1st, after the Election Commission rejected their unfounded claims of voter fraud in the November general election. Aung San Suu Kyi, the de facto leader of Myanmar, is being detained under trumped-up charges following her resounding re-election in November. What does this mean for the rest of Asia? And what's being done to stop the country sliding into further chaos? Our experts answer your questions. Where is Aung San Suu Kyi, and what will happen to her?
She hasn't been seen since the coup. She's currently under house arrest, and I'm afraid she's likely to remain in jail very likely for the rest of her life. She's currently been charged with 6 offences, ranging from the sort of ludicrously minor offence of illegally importing walkie-talkies to much more serious offences, for instance, of accepting bribes and breaking the Official Secrets Act.
The army clearly trumped up some charges because they want to get Aung San Suu Kyi out of the way. But it all hinges on whether the army is really able to assert control. And if it isn't, if some kind of compromise has to be brokered, then we could see Aung San Suu Kyi in power again.
I think she could become a kind of bargaining chip in negotiations between the generals, the shadow government. This is composed of deposed MPs from her own party, and the international community, which is trying to broker talks. But we first have to get to the negotiating table, and we're a very far way away from that now.
What are Myanmar's powerful neighbours, India and China, doing about this?
China has responded in a very ambiguous fashion. When the coup first happened, it described it as a major cabinet reshuffle. China has extensive interests in Myanmar. It views Myanmar as being an important notch on its Belt and Road, its massive infrastructure project. And it is very keen to see those investments be protected. So I think basically China's stance is we don't really mind who's in power as long as our interests are being taken care of.
India's also sort of wary of China's interest in Myanmar. China seems to see Myanmar as a potential sort of outlet to the Indian Ocean, and that's something that I think India's keen to curtail. But there's a lot going on in India at the moment, a terrible second wave of COVID-19, lots of very hard-fought state elections, and a government that itself has some sort of authoritarian tendencies, isn't that keen to be sort of stumping for democracy around the world. So India's response has really been quite muted.
Why aren't Western countries and the UN intervening? And what should they do?
Western countries are actually intervening. They have placed sanctions on the senior general, his cronies within the military, on their business interests. The UN isn't going to do anything except for issue strongly worded statements, and that is because China and Russia sit on the Security Council and will have vetoed any efforts to do something more robust. This is because China is loath to annoy whoever's in charge in Myanmar. And Russia is in the same camp, actually. Interestingly, Russia's deputy defense minister showed up at the army's big bash, its Armed Forces Day, recently in late March. So Russia is very keen to keep the army happy. Russia is another major arms supplier to the generals, and they don't want to lose out on the army's custom.
The only thing sort of beyond those kind of sanctions that many Burmese actually have been calling for, many of the student protesters have been calling for, is to literally sort of send troops and overturn the coup. But Myanmar is just too far away and too little known, and there's too little appetite for that kind of conflict. The idea that America or any European country would intervene by force is just fanciful, unfortunately. So I think the most that can be hoped for is some kind of smart sanction regime that sort of makes life difficult and awkward for the generals.
How is the Rohingya refugee crisis affected by the situation in Myanmar?
So for decades, the army has demonized Muslims and also Rohingyas and said that they do not belong in the country. And in 2017, they went on a kind of murderous rampage throughout this Rohingya community, raping, pillaging, murdering, causing some 700,000 to flee to Bangladesh. So there's been this refugee crisis afflicting the Burmese government and also neighboring Bangladesh for several years now. There are now over 1 million Rohingyas in the camps in Bangladesh. Now, the Rohingyas were very critical of Aung San Suu Kyi and her government for failing to resolve the crisis and for failing to kind of create the conditions that would allow for them to go home. So they were no fans of Aung San Suu Kyi, but they cannot be happy that their persecutors are now in government. Shortly after the coup, the senior general said he made some noises about wanting to bring the Rohingya home, but that was clearly just a ploy to placate the West. They're going to do nothing about the Rohingyas.
Even if there were to be some kind of restoration of a democratic government, unfortunately, there's a very strong anti-Muslim prejudice within Myanmar. And it's hard to imagine, even if other minority ethnic groups are given a sort of fairer treatment by the Burmese state, it's quite hard to imagine that the whole country will turn over a new leaf when it comes to the Rohingyas, unfortunately.
What effects will there be on neighbouring countries and Asia as a whole if Myanmar becomes a failed state?
The most obvious one that has been a problem for a very long time in Myanmar is drugs. So Myanmar was a big centre for heroin production for a long time. It still is, but it has more recently become the world's biggest producer of methamphetamines. And that's those are made, they're synthetic drugs made in these sort of borderlands where it's not clear who's in charge, and where both some of these ethnic militias and some army officers are making money through drug smuggling. That problem will presumably proliferate, and it's already very big. And then there are the other problems associated with the fighting and the protests and the turmoil going on. There are already some refugees crossing into Thailand and into India. There have been some cases of COVID. The whole health system has broken down during all the protests and demonstrations. So no one's really tracking COVID anymore, but some COVID cases showed up on the Chinese side of the Burmese border, to the alarm of the Chinese authorities. Presumably we'll see more of that kind of thing. It's not going to sort of cause total chaos, but all of these factors, drugs, disease, refugees, they're going to sort of breed instability in the surrounding countries.
Could civil war break out?
Myanmar has never been at peace. Not since it won independence from the British, the colonial power. Has it really been at peace? So there are these ethnic minorities in the pockets, in the sort of borders of the country, that have been waging wars of independence against the sort of central government all this while. What we're seeing now, I think, for the first time, however, in Burmese history, is the Bamar, the ethnic majority from which the army derives its troops, its soldiers. The Bamar are starting to turn on the army. Hundreds, some say thousands of Bamar are streaming from the heartland of the country into the borderlands, into these territories controlled by ethnic militias to get training, and are either joining those militias or coming back to the heartlands in order to wage a kind of guerrilla war against against the army. So we're seeing the makings of a kind of new front in this sort of forever civil war that's been raging in Myanmar.
What began as a very peaceful protest movement, because of the incredible brutality of the army's response, has already become a sort of low-level insurrection where all across the country, including in the Bamar heartland, city dwellers, villagers are resisting the army in whatever way they can, including violently. So, it's very uneven. The one side has all the weapons, in effect, but I'd say it already resembles a civil war.
What's the best strategy to restore democracy? Can the protesters succeed?
If the shadow government is able to enlist the support of enough of these ethnic militias, that would be one thing. Now, the ethnic militias aren't big enough to take down the army by themselves, but if they all kind of collectively started working together, they could spread the army very, very thin. And should the kind of economic pressure being applied, last for months, several years, and the spoils of war don't start to sort of filter down to the rank and file, that could start to distress rank and file soldiers, who will also not be enjoying the kind of opprobrium that they will be receiving from their communities, who will be very upset with them for siding with their oppressors. So the shadow government hopes that with the strikes, with the civil disobedience movement, and with the federal army that it hopes to amass, it will basically encourage enough soldiers from within the army to defect, to either desert or defect to their side, to the federal army's side.
What are the factors that cause a country to become a failed state? And will Myanmar become one?
If you look at the countries that are sort of widely acknowledged to be failed states around the world, the other obvious one within Asia is Afghanistan. The problem is that there's no one really in charge. There are various people claiming the right to run the country, but no one who's actually able to assert their authority over the whole country. And that is already true in Myanmar. That may be a temporary situation. It could be that with its brutal tactics, the army basically sort of grinds down the protests and very slowly reasserts control. But even if that happens, and that probably unfortunately is the likeliest outcome, but if that does happen, the army will then inherit a country that's been totally laid waste. So even under those circumstances, it's hard to say that it will be a normal country. It will take years to rebuild the administration, to rebuild the infrastructure, to sort of get the country working again. And I think, in addition to the tragedy of the overthrow of Burmese democracy, that's a whole second tragedy now unfolding, that whatever government prevails, the welfare of ordinary Burmese has been set back massively. I'm Edward McBride, the Economist Asia editor. You can read more about the protests in Myanmar by clicking the link. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.